She had tears in her eyes, and before he could even ask if she was okay, she whispered, "Please, I don't know what to do anymore. Before we get into this story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever felt like the universe just keeps pushing you into unexpected situations? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. And if you've ever had a moment that changed everything, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you'll want to hear how this story ends. Now, let me take you back to where it all started. John had never been the type to go on many blind dates, but this one felt different. Emily seemed like someone he could connect with, someone real. He had arrived early, checked in with the hostess, and was already waiting in the restaurant when his phone buzzed with the message. "I'm really sorry, but something came up and I can't make it tonight." A sinking feeling settled in his stomach. His last few dates had ended just like this. Empty promises, disappointments. He didn't know why he kept trying. Maybe he was just hoping for that one moment, something that would make the constant cycle of loneliness worth it. He sat back, pushing his empty plate to the side. The restaurant buzzed with noise, but it felt distant. His gaze wandered outside through the large glass windows, focusing on the people passing by, couples holding hands, families laughing together. He hadn't realized just how alone he'd felt until tonight. As he stood up to leave, he noticed a woman standing by her car in the parking lot. She was crouched down near a stroller, the evening light catching the exhaustion in her face. But then something caught his attention, a soft sob. John hesitated for a moment, unsure, but the sound pulled him closer. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the rawness of her vulnerability. Maybe it was because, in that moment, he recognized the deep, weary loneliness in her. Something he'd been feeling for a long time. He walked toward her slowly, trying to keep his steps quiet. As he neared, he saw her face, her cheeks wet with tears. 2 young children were beside her, one of them clinging to her side, the other looking around confused. "Excuse me," John called gently. The woman froze, wiping her tears quickly, as if trying to hide her pain. I don't want to bother you," John continued. "But are you okay?" The woman looked up at him, eyes red-rimmed. There was a brief moment of silence before she let out a shaky breath. Her voice was quiet, almost breaking. "I'm fine. Just a lot to handle right now." John glanced down at her children, both of them still staring up at him. He couldn't imagine what she was going through, managing her kids, the day-to-day, and now dealing with whatever had happened. Without thinking, John found himself asking, "Do you need help with something?" The woman shook her head, but then she looked at him again, a flicker of vulnerability passing through her eyes. "My date, he canceled. He was supposed to meet me here, and now I'm stuck." John couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy. "I'm sorry," he said softly, not really knowing what else to say. The woman let out a small laugh, though it was hollow. "It's fine," she said, her voice shaking as she tried to steady herself. "I'm used to it, but I have no idea how I'm going to explain this to my kids." Her words lingered in the air, and John saw the struggle in her eyes, an overwhelming sense of defeat. She wasn't just talking about the date. She was talking about everything. The weight of being a single mom, the struggles, the hope for something more that always seemed to slip through her fingers. The moment felt heavy, and John's heart ached. The tears she had tried to hide were the same kind of tears he had buried deep down inside himself for years. "I don't know what happened," she whispered, her voice now barely above a whisper. "But I thought maybe tonight would be different. Just one night where I wasn't invisible." John felt his chest tighten, his own thoughts swirling. The weight of the world seemed to settle on his shoulders. He'd been there before, feeling invisible, wondering if anything would ever change. But he knew one thing. This woman, Emily, was in pain, and he couldn't just walk away. John stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next. The evening air had grown cooler, and the noise of the city was a constant hum in the background. But all he could focus on was the woman in front of him, wiping away tears she clearly didn't want anyone to see. Her 2 young children, a boy and a girl, were still clinging to her, as if seeking comfort in their mother's presence. The boy, no older than 5, stared at John with wide eyes, unsure of what was happening. The little girl, barely 3, hid her face against her mother's leg, her small hands grasping at her sleeve. John's mind raced. What was he supposed to say? What was the right thing to do? "Hey," he finally said, his voice soft but clear. "I don't know what happened, but you shouldn't be out here alone. You're not bothering me." Emily lifted her head slightly, her eyes meeting his for the first time since he'd approached. There was a flicker of surprise in her gaze. She had probably expected him to turn around and leave like most people would. Instead, here he was, standing in front of her, still offering help. "I don't even know you," she said, her voice quiet, as though the weight of the evening was starting to make her words fall apart. She shook her head, a small sigh escaping her lips. "I guess I just thought, I don't know, that things would get better." John nodded slowly. He understood that feeling, expecting things to change only to find that the world had other plans. It wasn't easy, and it was even harder to hold on to hope when life kept knocking you down. "My date canceled," Emily continued, her words stumbling out. "It's not the first time, and I'm sure it won't be the last." She wiped her eyes again, a little too forcefully. I really thought tonight would be different. I was looking forward to it." There was a sadness in her voice that hit John hard. It wasn't just the disappointment of a canceled date. It was the exhaustion of feeling like you couldn't catch a break. It was the loneliness of trying to juggle being everything for your kids, while still trying to hold on to your own dreams. He stepped a little closer. "Maybe it wasn't meant to be," he said, then added quickly. "Not the date, I mean, maybe this is the right moment for something else." Emily gave him a small, uncertain smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Something else? Like what?" John didn't know exactly what he meant. He hadn't expected to be standing in a parking lot, talking to a stranger who was obviously going through something far bigger than the disappointment of a missed date. But something about her honesty, her vulnerability, felt like a call he couldn't ignore. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. "Maybe we could sit down somewhere, talk. Get you out of here for a while." Her eyes narrowed a little, as though she was sizing him up. John wasn't surprised. Trust didn't come easy, especially not for people like Emily, who had probably been let down by the world too many times. But then, she looked at her kids, who were tugging at her sleeves, and something softened in her expression. She glanced back at him and finally nodded. "I guess I could use a break," she said quietly. "It's been a long day." John smiled, relieved. "Great. I know a little diner nearby. Nothing fancy, but the coffee's good. And the food's better than you'd think." Emily let out a small laugh, and it was the first time John had heard her sound something other than exhausted. "I could definitely use some good coffee right now." They made their way to the diner in silence. The streets were quieter now, the glow of the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. Emily's kids, though tired, were quiet in the back seat, their small voices barely audible. John drove slowly, glancing over at Emily every now and then. He didn't want to make her feel uncomfortable, but there was something about her presence that tugged at his heart. She was a mother, struggling to make ends meet. He couldn't help but wonder about the life she led, the sacrifices she made every day for her children. When they arrived at the diner, it was exactly what John had described. Nothing fancy, but warm, cozy, and welcoming. It was the kind of place that felt like home, where you could forget about the world outside for a while. John opened the door for Emily, and the bell chimed softly above them. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, smiled as they entered. "Table for 2?" she asked, her voice friendly. John nodded. "Actually, we'll need a booth," he said, glancing back at Emily and her kids. The last thing he wanted was for them to feel uncomfortable or out of place. The waitress led them to a corner booth, and John helped Emily settle in. Her kids, who were now wide awake and fidgeting, clambered onto the bench beside her. "Don't worry about them," John said gently. "I'm sure they're just tired." He smiled, hoping to ease the tension that was still hanging in the air. As the waitress took their drink orders, Emily looked at John, her eyes softer now, less guarded. "Thanks for doing this," she said, her voice quieter. "I wasn't expecting it. But it's nice to have someone who actually cares, even if it's just for a little while." John's heart twisted, but he kept his face neutral. "You don't have to thank me. Sometimes, people just need to be there for each other." Emily nodded, her smile tinged with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. "Yeah, I guess we do." The booth was quiet now, the clatter of dishes and soft murmur of conversations around them almost comforting. John had already finished his coffee, but Emily had barely touched hers. Her kids, on the other hand, were playing with the sugar packets, their small hands spilling them across the table. John's mind wandered to the earlier conversation, the way Emily's eyes had softened when they spoke. She hadn't said much, but he'd sensed the weight of her silence. There was so much she wasn't saying. He could feel it in the way she held herself, like she was carrying something heavy, unwilling to share it just yet. But part of him wondered if she even realized she was holding it. He could tell she was doing her best to keep everything together. The way she'd acted when she first spoke to him, like she didn't want to ask for help, like she wasn't used to anyone offering it to her, had stayed with him. Emily looked up suddenly, catching his gaze. She hadn't meant to, he could tell. She quickly averted her eyes, staring down at her cup like it could give her the answers she needed. John could see the battle in her eyes, an internal struggle she was trying to hide. And for a moment he almost let it go. He almost let the conversation settle into comfortable silence. But something inside him told him to press a little more, to reach her. "You know," John started softly, his voice low enough that it didn't interrupt the stillness between them. "You don't have to be okay all the time." Emily tensed. She lifted her head slowly, her eyes flashing with something sharp. "What do you mean?" John sighed, running his hand through his hair. "I just mean, it's okay not to have it all together. I don't know what you're going through, but you don't have to act like everything's fine." She frowned, her lips tight. "I don't need anyone to feel sorry for me," she said quickly, her words more defensive than she intended. "I'm fine. I'm used to it." John held up his hands, trying to ease the tension. "I'm not trying to pity you. I'm just saying, it's okay to let people help, even if it's just for a minute." Emily's face softened, but only slightly. "You don't get it," she muttered under her breath. "I don't have the luxury of falling apart. Not when I have two little ones depending on me." John understood that more than he cared to admit. But there was still something in her tone, something deeper, that made him want to reach out further. "The world's not as harsh as you think," he said quietly, his voice steady. "You don't have to do it all by yourself." Emily looked at him then, a flicker of doubt in her eyes. She opened her mouth like she wanted to say something but stopped, her lips pressed together in a tight line. She was holding back, and John could see it. "Maybe," she said after a long pause, "but it feels like I have to. For them." John nodded slowly. "I get that. But if you keep pretending everything's fine, you're going to burn out. It's okay to ask for help, even if it's just a little bit." Emily looked down at the table, her fingers tracing the edge of her cup. She was quiet for a long time, lost in her own thoughts. Her kids had grown quiet too, their earlier energy fading as they snuggled into their mom. The girl rested her head on Emily's shoulder, her small arms wrapping around her neck, while the boy sat close to his mother, his eyes closing in sleep. There was something about the scene that felt so real, so familiar. A tired mother trying to balance the world on her shoulders, two children who needed her, and the weight of her own unspoken fears. "I don't want them to see me break," Emily said softly, more to herself than to him. John's heart clenched. He didn't know how to explain it, but he understood that fear. The fear of being seen as weak. The fear of letting people know you weren't perfect. He'd felt it too in different ways. "You don't have to be perfect to be good for them," John said quietly. "I'm sure they already see you as the best mom in the world. You don't have to do it all alone." Emily finally met his eyes again, her expression unreadable. There was something in her gaze, something she wasn't saying. But in that moment, John knew that this conversation wasn't just about what she was struggling with now. It was about something much bigger, something that had been eating at her for a long time. He wasn't going to push her to talk about it. Not yet. But the silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken words. The waitress returned with their food, a gentle interruption to the quiet conversation. The children, who had been nearly asleep, suddenly perked up at the sight of pancakes. Emily smiled at them, the first genuine smile John had seen all night. Her guard had dropped, just a little. "Thanks," she said to the waitress, her voice a bit softer now. John watched her carefully. There was something about her, something strong but fragile at the same time. She was holding it all together, but just barely. And he wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry all of it alone. The diner was busy now, with the soft clink of silverware and the hum of casual conversation filling the air. It was a Friday night, and families were trickling in for a late meal, the smell of grilled burgers and fresh coffee mixing with the soft scent of rain that had begun to fall outside. John and Emily sat across from each other, the space between them a quiet chasm. The kids had finished their food and were now drawing on the paper napkins, their heads bent low, scribbling furiously with crayons. Emily hadn't said much since their conversation earlier. She kept her eyes on the table, her hands clasped around her coffee cup. But every now and then, she would glance up at John, and he could see the weight of everything she was holding back. John wasn't sure what to say next. He had opened the door, but it wasn't his place to push any further. Still, the silence felt like a wall between them, and he could feel his own discomfort growing. It was hard to pretend that everything was fine when it was so clearly not. "Are they okay?" John asked, his voice breaking the quiet. His gaze shifted toward the kids, who were still drawing, oblivious to the adults' unspoken tension. Emily looked up, a small smile touching her lips. "Yeah, they're just tired. It's been a long day." John nodded, trying to read her expression. She wasn't giving anything away, but the faint sadness behind her smile was enough to make him want to offer more than just small talk. Still, he couldn't force her to open up. She'd done her best to keep the conversation light, to shield herself from anyone seeing the cracks. But something inside him told him that maybe, just maybe, this was the moment for them to truly connect. Not just as strangers, but as two people who understood what it meant to struggle, to fight for something better. "Do you always do everything alone?" John asked, his voice gentle but insistent. The question had been on his mind for a while. He wanted to know more, but he wasn't sure how to ask without pushing too hard. Emily's fingers tightened around her coffee cup, and she looked away. Her shoulders tensed, the subtle movement a clear sign that the question had hit a nerve. She didn't answer immediately, and for a moment, John wondered if he had overstepped. But then she took a deep breath, her eyes finding his once more. "What do you mean?" John shrugged, trying to keep it casual. "I just mean, it feels like you've been carrying everything by yourself, like you're afraid to ask for help. You don't have to do that, you know?" There was a long silence before Emily finally spoke. Her voice was quieter this time, the edge of defensiveness gone, replaced by something softer. "I've had to. I don't have a choice. I've always had to figure it out on my own." Her words hung in the air between them. They weren't just a statement. They were a reflection of everything she had been through. The years of struggle, the nights when she had to keep going even when everything felt too heavy. John leaned forward slightly, his voice calm. "It's hard, isn't it? Pretending like everything's fine when it's not." Emily glanced at him, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment. She seemed to hesitate, as if weighing her next words. She hadn't expected to be asked something so personal, but now that the question was out there, it felt like something she couldn't ignore. "I guess I don't have a choice," she said quietly. "If I let myself fall apart, then, who will take care of them?" She gestured to her kids, who were still drawing, lost in their own world. "They need me to be strong. They need me to keep it together." John's heart ached. He could see it in her eyes, the weight of being the only one who could keep things going. The pressure to be everything all the time, to never show weakness, never let anyone see how much she was struggling inside. "You don't have to be strong all the time, Emily," John said softly. It's okay to let someone else carry the weight for a little while. She shook her head slowly, but this time there was no sharpness in her response. I've never had anyone who could carry it for me. I can't just rely on other people to fix things. John felt his chest tighten at her words. He could hear the resignation in her voice. The years of doing it alone, the fear of ever depending on someone else, even for a moment. I know it's hard, John said gently, but sometimes you don't have to rely on others to fix everything. Sometimes it's just about being there. Just being there without any expectations. Emily's eyes softened as she stared at him, her fingers still clutching the edge of her cup. It wasn't just the words he was saying. It was the way he was saying them. There was no pity in his voice, no judgment, just understanding. And for the first time that evening, Emily felt like she wasn't alone in the world. That maybe, just maybe, there was someone who cared about more than just what she could do for others. I don't know how to do that, she admitted softly. I've always had to do it on my own. John gave her a small smile, his voice reassuring. We all learn at some point. It doesn't happen overnight, but you're not alone in this. Not if you don't want to be. The night had grown quieter, the diner nearly empty now except for a few late-night customers scattered across the room. Emily and John sat in the same booth, their food long forgotten. The kids were asleep, their heads nestled on their mother's shoulder. The quiet between them felt different now, softer but heavier, as if the weight of unspoken truths had grown too much to ignore. Emily's fingers gripped the edge of her cup, her knuckles white as she stared out the window, lost in thought. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still dark, the world outside drenched in a quiet, heavy stillness. John watched her carefully. He could see it in her posture, the way her shoulders were tight and her jaw clenched. He had learned that when she went silent, something was brewing inside her. A storm of emotions that she wasn't ready to share yet. He understood that feeling, that fear of being too much, of letting everything fall apart in front of someone else. But tonight felt different. The distance between them had shrunk just enough that John could sense the crack in her armor. And despite everything, despite the walls she'd built, he knew she was close to breaking. Emily, John said softly, his voice breaking through the quiet. You don't have to keep pretending. She flinched at the words, like he'd struck her. Slowly, she turned her gaze to him. Her eyes still guarded, but with something else behind them. Pain, maybe, or the exhaustion that had been hiding beneath the surface for so long. I'm not pretending, she said, her voice barely a whisper. John met her gaze, his voice steady. You're carrying so much, Emily. You don't have to carry it alone anymore. She shook her head, her face tightening. You don't understand. You don't know what it's like to have to keep going when everything is falling apart. John leaned in, his tone soft but insistent. Then let me understand. For a moment, Emily was silent. She looked at her kids, still curled up asleep in the booth, their faces peaceful despite the chaos of the day. And then, with a deep breath, she let the walls down just a little. I've been doing this for so long, she said, her voice raw. Raising them by myself. I don't even know what it's like to have someone else to lean on. I've been through so much. I just keep going because I don't know what else to do. I don't know how to stop. If I stop, then everything falls apart. John felt a pang in his chest at the words. He didn't know her entire story, but he could hear the desperation in her voice. The weight of all the years she had carried on her own. Never letting anyone in, never letting anyone see how much it hurt. You don't have to be perfect, Emily, John said quietly, his voice a gentle reassurance. You don't have to be everything for everyone. It's okay to not have it all together. Emily's eyes flickered with emotion, but she quickly blinked it away. I don't have a choice. I can't just break down. I have to keep going for them. John nodded, understanding the depth of her fear. I know, but sometimes, breaking down doesn't mean everything is over. It's just the first step toward healing, toward finding a way to move forward. Together, Emily stared at him for a long moment, her chest rising and falling with the weight of her breathing. The room seemed to hold its breath, the soft clink of silverware from the last few patrons fading into the background. "I don't know if I can trust anyone," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "I've been let down so many times." John felt his heart ache for her. He didn't want to push her, but he couldn't stand seeing her carry this burden alone any longer. "I get it. Trust isn't something you give away easily. But you don't have to do this alone." She finally looked at him, her gaze steady but filled with so many emotions. It was like a dam had broken in her heart, and for the first time in a long time, she was allowing someone to see the rawness inside her. John's hand moved instinctively, resting gently on top of hers. The simple gesture felt like a promise, something silent but strong. "I don't want to be alone anymore," she said softly, almost as if she was speaking to herself. "But I don't know how to let go." John gave her a reassuring smile. "You don't have to know everything right now. You don't have to figure it all out today. We'll take it one step at a time, okay? But you don't have to carry everything by yourself. I'm here." Emily didn't respond immediately, but the way she squeezed his hand in return said more than words ever could. She was scared, yes, but she was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to do it all alone. And for the first time that night, she allowed herself to feel the tiniest glimmer of hope. The air inside the diner was thick with tension. The hum of the remaining patrons seemed distant, as though John and Emily existed in a world of their own. The kids were still asleep, their heads resting against their mother's shoulder, their small bodies curled up in peaceful exhaustion. But Emily felt far from peaceful. She sat there, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her, the weight of everything she'd been holding and threatening to spill over. It had been days since that conversation, the one where she'd finally opened up to John, letting him see the cracks in her carefully constructed walls. Since then, she'd been walking a thin line between fear and hope, terrified of what it meant to trust someone, yet craving the kind of support she hadn't let herself want in years. John watched her closely, noticing how her hands twisted around the edge of her coffee cup, as if she were trying to hold everything together by sheer will. But the tension in her body was a telltale sign. The facade was crumbling. "I'm sorry," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. John didn't respond immediately. He simply sat back, giving her space, waiting for her to say more. He knew she was holding back, but he also knew that, at some point, she'd have to let it out. She had to. I don't know how to do this," Emily continued, her voice shaky now. She wasn't looking at him, her gaze fixed firmly on the table. "I don't know how to let someone in. I don't know how to trust that it won't just fall apart again." John's heart ached at her words. He had seen the walls she'd built, the ways she pushed people away, always fearing that they would leave. And he understood the feeling. It wasn't easy to trust, especially when life had taught her the hard way that not everyone could be relied upon. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," he said softly, his voice full of compassion. "But you don't have to carry it alone anymore, Emily. You don't have to." She let out a shaky breath, her eyes finally lifting to meet his. There was something raw in her gaze now. Fear, yes, but also a flicker of something else. Something that told John she was starting to believe what he was saying, even if it was just a tiny bit. "I don't know if I can," Emily admitted, her voice breaking. "I've been let down too many times. I've had to do everything myself for so long. I don't know what it would be like to let someone help me, to let someone see me like this." John leaned in slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. "It's okay to be vulnerable, Emily. You don't have to be perfect." Her lips trembled as she let out a short laugh, but it wasn't a happy sound. "I don't know how to be anything else." The words stung, but John didn't shy away. He reached out, his hand gently covering hers, a silent gesture that spoke volumes. "I'm not asking you to be perfect," John said, his voice steady. "I'm just asking you to let me be here for you. Let me help, even if it's just a little. You don't have to do it all alone." Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly blinked them away. She looked down at their hands, the quiet sob that escaped her lips making John's chest tighten. He wanted to pull her into his arms, but he knew this was something she had to process in her own time. I've tried so hard to be strong, she whispered, the words barely audible now. I've tried to be everything they need. But I'm scared. I don't know how to let go of that. How to let someone else take care of me. John squeezed her hand gently, his voice low but filled with warmth. It's not about letting someone take care of you. It's about letting them be there with you. Through the hard parts, through the messy parts. And maybe, just maybe, it'll make things a little easier. You don't have to do it all by yourself. Emily's shoulders trembled as she took a deep breath. The weight of her words seemed to hang in the air. But in that moment, she finally let herself believe what John was saying. It wasn't about perfection, about being strong all the time. It was about being real, being seen. I don't know if I'm ready, she whispered, her voice small but earnest. You don't have to be ready, John replied, his words steady and sincere. I'm not going anywhere, and you don't have to decide everything right now. Just take it one step at a time. We can figure it out together. There was a long silence as Emily absorbed his words. Slowly, she turned her hand, letting her fingers intertwine with his. The gesture was small, but it meant everything. It was a step toward trust, a tiny crack in the wall she'd built around her heart. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel so alone. The sun had barely risen when John walked into the diner the next morning, his eyes immediately landing on Emily. She was sitting at her usual booth, her tired eyes scanning the menu like she was trying to make a decision she couldn't quite bring herself to make. Her kids were at home today, school was out, but the exhaustion on Emily's face was unmistakable. Her shoulders were hunched, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of coffee, and the uneaten toast in front of her seemed like the last thing on her mind. John took a slow breath before walking over. There was something different about the way he approached her today. Softer, more understanding, but with an underlying determination. He knew that this wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was a moment of truth. "Morning," he said as he sat down across from her, his voice quieter than usual. Emily didn't immediately respond. Instead, she took a long sip from her mug, her gaze focused on the surface of the coffee, as if it could give her the answers she needed. "I've been thinking," she finally said, her voice a little hoarse, "about what we talked about yesterday, about trust." John nodded, waiting, his hand resting casually on the table. He wasn't going to rush her. He'd learned that much. When Emily was ready to speak, she would. "I'm scared," she whispered, almost like she was confessing something shameful. "Scared of failing, scared of trusting and being hurt again. But I'm even more scared of what'll happen if I don't try. If I keep doing this by myself." John leaned in just a little closer, his expression warm but serious. "You don't have to do this by yourself anymore, Emily. You don't have to face everything alone." There was a long silence, and for a moment, it felt like the entire world was holding its breath. Emily's eyes flickered with something. Maybe relief, maybe doubt, but she didn't pull away. "I don't know how to do this," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to let someone in, how to let someone help me. I don't even know what that would look like." John's gaze softened. He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers, the touch steady and reassuring. "It doesn't have to look like anything. It just has to be real. No expectations, no pressure. Just two people trying to figure it out together." For a moment, Emily was still, her gaze downcast, but John could see the battle happening behind her eyes. Her fear, her doubt, they were there, yes, but something else was shifting. Something fragile but powerful was beginning to take root. She was starting to believe that she didn't have to carry the world alone. "I don't know if I'm ready," she admitted quietly. John squeezed her hand, his tone unwavering. "It's okay not to be ready. You don't have to be. You don't have to have all the answers. You just have to take one step at a time." A small, hesitant smile tugged at the corners of Emily's lips. It wasn't much, but it was something. For the first time, she wasn't afraid to let herself feel it, to let herself trust that maybe, just maybe, things could change. John watched her, feeling a strange mix of hope and gratitude. He didn't know where this path would take them, but for the first time he wasn't afraid of the unknown. He wasn't afraid to be there for her, to be someone she could lean on. Emily took a deep breath, her hand still resting in his. Her voice was steady when she spoke again, though there was a softness there, a willingness she hadn't shown before. "I'm scared, John, but I think I'm ready to try, to let someone else in, to let you in." John's heart swelled, and he felt the weight of those words like a promise, not just from her, but from himself as well. He was in this for however long it took. "We'll take it slow," John said, his voice low and reassuring. "One step at a time. I'm not going anywhere." And for the first time, Emily believed him. The sun was setting, casting a soft golden light over the small park near Emily's apartment. The children were laughing in the distance, playing tag near the swings, their voices full of joy. For the first time in what felt like forever, Emily felt the warmth of the moment, not just from the sun, but from the people around her. She sat on the park bench, John beside her, his hand resting lightly over hers. They weren't speaking much, there was no need for words. Their silence was comfortable, filled with a quiet understanding, a kind of peace that had eluded her for years. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind. After the conversation in the diner, Emily had started to let go of the walls she'd built around herself. Little by little, she had allowed John in. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. And somewhere along the way, she realized that it wasn't just about letting John help her. It was about letting herself be seen, truly seen. And in return, she had learned to open up in ways she hadn't known were possible. They had talked about everything. Her fears, his past, the struggles they each faced. It wasn't perfect. It was messy, sometimes painful, but it was real. And it was what they both needed. "I'm glad you're here," Emily said quietly, breaking the silence. She looked at John, her heart swelling with gratitude. There was no hesitation in her voice now, no fear of being vulnerable, just truth. John smiled, his eyes warm and steady. "I'm glad I'm here too." He shifted closer, lifting his free hand to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The simple gesture made Emily's breath catch in her throat. There was something so gentle in the way he touched her, as if he understood the fragility of her heart and wanted to hold it with care. "Everything's different now, isn't it?" she asked, her voice soft. John nodded, his smile widening. "Yeah, it is. But it feels right, doesn't it?" Emily couldn't help but smile back, her chest full of emotion. "It does." They sat there for a while, watching the sunset together. The world around them seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of them and the simple joy of the moment. There was no rush, no expectations, just the quiet promise that they were in this together, ready to face whatever came next. A little while later, Emily stood up, brushing the dirt from her jeans. "The kids are going to need dinner soon. They'll be wondering where I am." John stood as well, offering his hand. "Let's go home then, together." Emily took his hand, feeling the warmth of his touch spread through her. They walked side by side, the sounds of their footsteps soft against the pavement. The kids were already running toward them, their excited voices filling the air. For the first time in a long time, Emily didn't feel weighed down by everything. She didn't feel like she had to do it all alone. She had John and she had her children, and that was enough. "Hey, Mom, guess what?" her youngest called, grinning from ear to ear. "I made a new friend at the park." Emily smiled down at her son, her heart light. "That's great, sweetie." As they all walked back toward her apartment, the sun dipping lower in the sky, Emily's thoughts drifted to where they had started. All those days of feeling alone, of carrying the weight of everything on her shoulders. She never could have imagined that something as simple as a conversation, a chance meeting, would lead her here, toward a future she hadn't dared to dream about. But now, with John by her side, she realized she was ready to dream again. "I think we're going to be okay," Emily said, her voice full of certainty. John looked at her, his expression gentle but sincere. "I know we are." And in that moment, she believed him. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.